All right, so I'm Levi Wolf, and this is Taylor. And we're going to talk a little bit today, splitting our lightning talk in half into two independent strikes. We'll talk a little bit about our PRISM idea and sort of a typology of scale and multi-scale study. So a lot of the current research on multi-scale research in geography is divided by a couple of different fundamental questions or concerns. One of them that Seth was sort of touching on about talking about an ontology of scale is whether or not scales are sort of these levels at which processes operate versus sort of emerging independently from social processes and individual interactions. This is the idea that there's like a level of analysis that is causal or that is generated from a particular social or behavioral process, whereas a particular level, an observation scale, is one at which data is collected and that we're kind of restricted to analyzing that scale. A lot of the research Stuart has been doing in his lab is on variation, about estimates of processes and how and whether social processes or phenomena change over space. And then the last part that Taylor and I have called sort of seeking scale versus expressing scale is the idea that we're looking for whether or not there's a true scale of analysis or whether or not we're kind of getting different stories by looking at different vertical slices. So this is sort of a reformulation of a lot of the scale debate in the 1990s and early 2000s, which thought about the difference between scale as an ontological construct and an epistemological construct. So thinking about, no good typology is useful without a classification table. Here's like a rough discussion of where we think a couple of these things exist. To single out a couple common ones that we see in the literature a lot, stuff like K-comparison studies is where you take maybe 3 or 4 different aggregations and you estimate the same model or the same statistic. And stories can change, right? This is the classic Simpson's paradox kind of issue. In this case, we're talking about differences between observation scales. We've got an exogenous notion of scale. Whereas something like in a GWR or in a Gaussian process model, scale is endogenous. It emerges from the data. We discover the level at which the process operates. The interesting thing I'd like to note about sort of multi-level techniques is that a lot of people think of these as explicitly sort of exogenous scales where we have concrete independent levels and we analyze the relationships at those levels. But in fact, multi-level models give you a really good way to estimate the level at which a scale makes the most sense and has the highest predictive power. So in a way, it kind of sits always blending a couple of different traditional approaches. I don't have a lot of time to get into the nitty-gritty of sort of the differences between like Gaussian processes, GWR, and eigenvector spatial filtering and other things like that. But I will hand it off to Taylor to talk about sort of where we go from these ideas.
Yeah, so we've been doing a bit of thinking about kind of how we differentiate process scale from other types of scales and how we can measure process scale. And so one of the differences that we've been looking at is that typically for one process we have many relationships. It's not described by one single relationship, there's many things. And so the example we have here is of voting behavior, how it depends on things like local income or an individual's ideological commitments or a larger social network, but it could also be something like a health outcome. So an individual is affected by the things that are locally around them, also maybe by policies at the county level or also at the state level. So it's many relationships that are kind of blending together to drive that process. And at the same time, each of those relationships can have its own scale or scale of relationship with that. So here we have 3 different relationships relating individuals to that system at different levels. And so the idea that we've kind of thinking about to have process scale differentiated is that it's really an interaction of many geographic scales, where geographic scale would be kind of the extent of a study or a phenomenon. And so we are looking at models, and we think we need models that can give us these multiple indicators of geographic scale in a combined way, really, in one framework. So we've come up with the idea of a PRISM just because it really is intuitive to think of how we can decompose the different kind of groups of variation, but not in the data itself, in the way that we make inferences about the data. So if we're making inferences about relationships, how do we then say that the different relationships have different levels of variation? So that kind of leads us to this idea of an indicator of scale or a process indicator of scale, where we're talking about prisms. And some of the things we're thinking about and how we can move that forward are, when we have an inference on an indicator, are two scales different? So if we measure two scales, are they statistically the same? Are they statistically different? Are they slightly different? Are they very different? And are we certain about that? How do you measure uncertainty about process scale? And are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So it's one thing to say that we think we're measuring scale, but can it be kind of corrupted by other things? If it's statistical measure, there's lots of things we know that can kind of degrade our signal. So how does that then impact our ability to measure a concept like scale? And then finally, this kind of ties into the larger debate about reproducibility, but can we transfer that meaning to another study area or another similar phenomenon? So really, what does it mean, and how can it be compared? Can we use two different methods, and should we get the same type of measurement on scale, even though those are different methods? So those are kind of the topics that we've kind of debating and trying to grasp at in terms of process scale.
So that's our lightning talk on that. Thanks.
Anybody have one burning question about a framework and scale? Gotcha.
Very quick question. So you talk a lot about processes, but in a lot of situations we don't even know what the process is. So how do you guys think about that?
Right. So that's part of the issue of this distinction between an ontological notion and an epistemological notion, right? So does it make sense to analyze a particular level? And that's sort of the natural scale of analysis. Or are there sort of levels that cause patterns at higher levels of aggregation? We don't know the answer to a lot of those things. Behavioral processes can drive patterns in geographical data, but then structures and like social supersystems can also constrain individual behavior. I'm not really sure that it makes sense to talk about the process having an individual geographic scale, right? It's the intersection of all of these sort of complex multivariate relationships.
And then if I could add, one of the things you had in the table, one type of measurement was decomposition. So I think we had that as kind of one of these categories that blends between a lot of the different facets, but you could use that theoretically on a single data set, like one observation, one variable, and decompose that variable into different scales. And you might not necessarily know that any one of those scales is a priori important, but you can then kind of look at how that variation decomposes and see if one of them has a trend or a statistic of interest or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be relationships. That's kind of what we've been looking at as what we think is maybe different or it could be improved. But there's also some stuff for exploring scale without knowing.
For instance, like Bill Clark's work on segregation that looks at the continuous surface of an estimator of segregation as you increase or decrease the egohood around any individual environment. There's no true segregation measure or scale at any one point along that. I see your hand shooting up there. But
quick follow-up from Jingle.
Very quick comment. I think it's very interesting talk and a lot of interesting ideas, questions. But these are exact the questions we as landscape ecologists were debating and asking during 1980s and 1990s. I hope you dig into the literature. We already have a lot of answers. I'm sorry to see it.
Fortunate.
So thank you very much, both
Thank
of
you.
you. Thank you.